MSNBC host Mehdi Hasan had this to say about Elon Musk's Twitter takeover. Let's listen.
I mean, it's easy in American discourse to talk simplistically about the far left and the far right as two equally dangerous fringe blocs. Elon Musk has done it plenty of times just in the past week. But here's the difference. America's far left wants to give us free healthcare and free childcare. America's far right wants to give us white supremacy and no democracy. And this asymmetrical polarization of US politics would be laughable if it weren't so horrifying. We are living through an unspeakably dangerous moment. The pro-QAnon, pro-neo-Nazi faction of the Republican Party is poised to expand dramatically come the midterms. We're just 2 years away from Donald Trump very possibly re-seizing executive power. If that happens, we may look back on this past week as a pivotal moment, when a petulant and not so bright billionaire casually bought one of the world's most influential messaging machines and just handed it to the far right.
Musk responded back, quote, "Same org that covered up Hunter Biden laptop story, had Harvey Weinstein story early and killed it, and built Matt Lauer his rape office. Lovely people."
Lovely people indeed. Here to weigh in on liberal media's continuing outrage over Musk's Twitter acquisition is associate editor at Reason, my colleague Liz Wolfe. Welcome, Liz.
Thanks for having me.
So, thanks for joining us. And I know, you like me have been observing this kind of absolute freak out, meltdown mentality among many in the kind of mainstream and progressive media, Mehdi Hasan absolutely being one of them, who's just, losing his mind over this. And I thought that commentary was really reflective of that. What did you make of it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, fundamentally, Elon Musk is not a neo-Nazi or somebody who's going to allow QAnon supporters to have this wild free reign. I think he's really overstating the case. Elon Musk might be the single person in America who is doing the most to transition us away from really harmful fuel reliance, bringing he should be somebody who should be heralded as a savior by anybody who is climate change concerned, on his work with Tesla alone. But also in terms of political affiliations, I think it's important that we not overstate the case. Musk is not some wild far-right extremist. Musk is a centrist who I think feels somewhat abandoned by his own party. I mean, he was an Obama voter. I think he feels as though the party moved and left him behind, something many people have reacted to.
Well, to that point, in response to being called far right, Musk tweeted out this meme depicting Musk as being on the same political spectrum over the years, while the left keeps moving farther left. This sparked a very online debate on what is called asymmetric polarization, that one political party is getting more partisan than the other, or that one side is moving closer to its ideological pole than the other. I'm curious about this, in part because it does seem as though talking about some of the neo-Nazi things and these kind of more radical extreme things does miss the point that there are some basic ways in which the Conservative Party has not stuck to its own ideals, has moved right on economic issues, not supporting basic minimum wage raises that keep up with inflation, the gap between the very rich and the very poor growing enormously over the last 50 years since the time when a lot of conservatives say that was the ideal time in American history, the gap between average CEO pay and average worker pay going from 1 to 30 to 1 to 300. I mean, is he missing the forest for the trees here?
I think the right has moved, if anything, has moved left or not moved very much on economic issues. Compared to 10 years ago, think of like Tea Party type people.
So where's the conversation on the $15 minimum wage? Why is it that
they never supported that?
Well, that's the entire point, that there is not even neither party is making even the most superficial of gestures to actually meeting the needs of labor.
My sense is on policy, the meme is definitely incomplete. On policy, the Democratic Party, I think, has moved further to the left than the Republican Party has moved to the right on raw policy. With like a couple issues, immigration, they've certainly gotten more hard right on. Other things they've not. Now that misses the way in which the Republican Party has become kind of weird, for lack of a better word, over the last few years.
Say more things.
What do you think about it, Liz?
Well, in terms of abandoning labor, I think that's a really good point. And I think like people like David Shor, a Democratic Party analyst who has become very widely reviled by a bunch of wokesters on the left, David Shor has been making this point about how the Democratic Party is now interestingly bifurcated. It used to be both the party of labor representing the needs of the working class and this party that's this bastion of highly educated, people who went to Ivy Leagues, who live in big cities like New York and DC. Now it's sort of increasingly and bizarrely the highly educated coastal elite people, with some of those working class people who would typically be represented by labor actually sort of shifting more toward identifying as independents, maybe not even identifying as Republicans per se, but not really feeling at home in the Democratic Party. And I think we see this a little bit with recent polling data that emerged about Latino voters and how they're some of the people who most disapprove of Biden's job performance so far out of all demographic groups.
Yeah. And it strikes me as a little fault. What Mehdi Hassan said, right, compared to, the far right is they want to Nazism, the far left wants to give you free health care. Well, so the right would say, if we're comparing apples to apples, we're talking about, right, the people on the far left who are like burning down buildings and looting stores and smashing windows, and like that is the comparison to the people who stormed the Capitol.
That's not a political orientation.
Well, but neither is
what?
Antifa and Nazism are.
Sure, but we also,
to the extent that they're violent uprisings within the U.S. It's Proud Boys versus Antifa.
There have been elected you'd be hard pressed to find a Democrat who has said anything positive about any of the property destruction that happened in the course of 2020. In fact, Joe Biden
ran. It wasn't
happening.
They just say nothing to see here.
Joe Biden ran arguing against all of that, saying he wanted to fund the police. Eric Adams, new mayor of New York, says he wants to fund the police. Democrats have been lockstep and tough on crime stuff with Republicans, in fact, trying to out-message them on all of that stuff. On the other hand, it was difficult to find a Republican who would condemn the 1/6 attacks, despite that not having to be something that was so closely associated with the institution of the Republican Party. They chose to kind of get in bed with that and a lot of the other kind of cultural Trump era phenomenon that ended up happening.
Yeah, that's the weirdness I mentioned. There's weirdness.
I feel like none of us would really go to bat to defend the 1/6 sort of apologist, because all of that was absolutely astonishingly, unprecedentedly insane. But I do think maybe the best example of sort of like extremist and relatively mainstream ideology on the left is like stuff related to, I think Republicans are obviously not covering themselves in glory when it comes to critical race theory and trans issues in schools. But like we had the whole pronouns controversy this weekend where New York Times was publishing that review of the book Genderqueer, and apparently decided to stay away from using this author's preferred pronouns, and then came under fire from a lot of people for not using the pronouns of a and ear and all these things. And I think maybe that's something that centrists like Musk are like, I don't understand what this is, and I'm afraid that if I screw up something as simple and sort of nonsensical as using the pronoun air, I don't know how to pronounce it, E-I-R.
Well,
and I take the point. I know what you're going to say, Brianna.
What am I going to say, Robbie?
You're going to say that's not democratic.
That's not the left, and that's not politics.
It's educators and activists and
that's liberals
who
are using that identity politics stuff as a substitute for substantive politics. And if we're talking about the left-right spectrum,
and it irritates people like Elon Musk, and and those people need to cool it.
I think
because they're ruining it for the whole Democratic Party, because they are being made to be thought that they are the Democratic Party.
But there's also something interesting that's happening here, which is like these things are much easier to talk about than actual issues of like class and disparity.
Exactly.
And so this is something that on TV segments or on Twitter, this is something where so much of the conversation focuses on it, and perhaps it gets disproportionate airtime. But I mean, I, at least for one, I pay a lot of attention to the reporting of people like Katie Herzog and Jesse Singal, who are focusing not just on the sensationalist internet, Twitter disputes over these things, but the specific ways where some of these far left radicals are actually creeping into institutions like academia and medicine. And so that's sort of where I wish that conversation would go. And I think it's very fair to criticize, lots of actual people who are concerned with class and labor issues on the left are not the people who really give a damn about this.
Yeah, Liz. So I agree with that, and I think that's why Mehdi has half a point. I think he rightly identifies when he describes the left a focus on those kinds of substantive economic issues, or issues like Medicare for All, which are overwhelmingly popular not just with Democrats but with the Republicans and independents as well. The issue from my end is that these identity issues are raised, I would argue, disproportionately by people on the right, even if they are in the cultural moment because of the left, to distract from the fact that the right is not actually in place, that it has abandoned all of its class commitments to the extent that there's a faux populism going on, and is hoping that nobody notices how much they've shifted because there's a conversation about the left's cultural left shift instead.
I think that's a fair argument, but then that definitely raises the question of, if the right has abandoned any commitments to fighting for the working class, why do we see people behaving the way they do, right? Why would Latino voters be so disapproving of Joe Biden? Or why would we see in lots of sort of interesting swing counties that are highly composed of tough on crime white people and some tough on crime Latinos, but like along the border, very, very poor people, we see them going for Republicans increasingly. Like,
well, who else they went for, Liz? Those Latino voters also went for Bernie Sanders. And where does he fall on that left-right spectrum, according to Mehdi Hassan's little diatribe there?
Yeah. Well, fair enough. We can go head to head with the data, but I am curious about, like, if I'm not interested in, I'm not a fan of the sort of increasingly populist right that, for many reasons, but I am interested in, like, if the working class is so abandoned by them, why are they acting the way that they are in terms of endorsing them and in terms of shifting away from the Democratic Party? Like, to me, that's sort of the unanswered question that really you could spend hours and hours and hours attempting to theorize on.
Well, Liz, thank you so much for joining us. We always appreciate it.
Thank you.
Next up, Tulsi Gabbard weighed in on President Biden's new misinformation governance board, so we'll discuss that.